I want to start by saying something that most people in my line of work would never admit out loud. I was afraid of Driven Schral. Not the polite kind of afraid, not the kind where you feel a little nervous and then it passes. I mean the deep kind. The kind that sits in your chest like a stone and doesn't move even when you're 3 star systems away from the man and surrounded by people who are armed to the teeth. That kind of afraid. The kind that makes your hands sweat when someone just mentions his name in conversation. Driven Schral, the pale blade, the silence before the screaming. He had about 17 different names depending on which part of the galaxy you were asking in, but every name meant the same thing. It meant, don't push him, don't cross him, and whatever you do, don't stand between him and his contract. He was Velhari. You know what that means if you've spent any time in the outer trade routes. The Velhari are, I don't know how to describe them without making it sound like some kind of folklore. They're tall, bone pale. Their eyes don't reflect light the normal way, they seem to absorb it, like looking into something that used to be a person and then became something else entirely. They move without sound. Not quietly, I mean literally without any sound. You could be standing on a metal grating surrounded by silence, and a Velhari could cross the entire room and you'd never hear a footstep. Nothing. Just suddenly they're somewhere they weren't before. Driven was everything his species was supposed to be, and then several things more. He'd been operating as a freelance mercenary for, by some estimates, close to 90 standard years. He didn't look it. Velhari aged slowly, and Driven looked maybe 40 by human reckoning, though that particular comparison would become much more relevant to this story before it was finished. He'd worked every side of every conflict in the outer reach. He'd taken contracts from governments, from crime syndicates, from corporations, from individuals rich enough to afford his asking price, which was not small. He'd completed every contract he'd ever accepted, every single one. In 90 years, there was not one failed job in his record. That was the thing about Driven Schral. It wasn't just that he was dangerous. It was that he was reliable in his danger. You always knew exactly how bad things were going to get. That kind of consistency in his line of work was more terrifying than unpredictability. I was assigned as his liaison officer for a period of roughly 4 months. The Neutral Compact had contracted him to provide security oversight for a series of high-value diplomatic exchanges on the station. I can't say which station. That's still in the restricted file, but if you have clearance, you'll know the one I mean. My job was essentially to stand close enough to him to pass messages and stay out of his way the rest of the time. Most liaisons who got that assignment tried to request transfers. I didn't, only because I'd heard that requesting a transfer when you'd been assigned to Driven Schral's detail was considered, in certain circles, a formal acknowledgement that you were useless, and I was 32 years old and trying to build a career. So I swallowed whatever good sense I had and showed up. The first thing he said to me, and I remember it exactly because it was strange enough that I wrote it down in my personal log that night, was not a greeting. It was not an introduction. He looked at me for a long moment the way a Velhari looks at things, which is like they're performing a calculation behind their eyes and haven't decided yet whether you're a variable or a constant. Then he said, "You're going to ask me things. Before you ask, I want you to understand one piece of information that will save us both considerable difficulty." I said yes, obviously. What else would you say? He said, "Never make the humans angry." And then he walked away and started reviewing the station's security layout. And that was the end of the conversation. I stood there for what was probably 10 seconds just processing what had happened. I'd expected him to tell me something about his operational protocols, his communication preferences, what he needed from my office in terms of logistical support. Instead, he'd given me a warning, an aphorism, some kind of cryptic professional philosophy. It took me 4 months to understand what he meant. The station was called Meridian Cross. It sat at the intersection of three major trade corridors in what the navigation charts called the Middle Reach, which was a polite way of saying it was too far from the core systems to be properly governed and too heavily trafficked to be ignored. 12,000 beings lived and worked on Meridian Cross on any given day. Maybe 3,000 more passed through on transits. The diplomatic exchanges the compact was facilitating were sensitive enough that they needed someone with Dreven's specific kind of reputation to make sure the wrong people stayed out of the rooms where the right people were talking. I spent my first week on the station learning the layout, learning who the regular faces were, learning the rhythms of the place, which was something I'd been trained to do and was actually reasonably good at. Meridian Cross had a district near the lower cargo bays that the locals called the Tangle. That was where the mercenaries drank. That was where the information brokers worked. That was where you found the kind of beings who moved between legal and illegal the way most people move between rooms. It was also, and this is relevant, where about 60% of the station's human population spent their off hours. See, there were maybe 400 humans on Meridian Cross at any given time. Most of them were workers, dock workers, maintenance crews, engineering staff. The humans had come out to the Middle Reach because the wages were better than what the core colonies were offering and because, as I came to understand, humans had a particular relationship with frontier conditions that made them genuinely well-suited to the work. They were adaptable in ways that species with longer histories in space hadn't needed to develop, because humans had done their adapting fast, under pressure, in the span of about 2 centuries, which in galactic terms was roughly the blink of an eye. The mercenary community on the station regarded the humans with a kind of casual contempt that was, I eventually realized, mostly just habit. It wasn't that anyone had thought hard about it. It was more that humans were new to the wider galaxy. They were still figuring things out. They didn't have the institutional military prestige of the Velhari, or the economic power of the Keth Consortium, or the ancient history of the Orin. So they occupied a lower rung on the unspoken hierarchy that every multi-species environment develops, whether anyone admits it or not. Dreven didn't share this view. I didn't know that yet in the first week. I just knew that he seemed to pay attention to the human workers in a way that was different from how he regarded everything else. Not warmer, exactly. Dreven Schraal was not what anyone would call warm. More like watchful, careful. The way you're careful around something you've learned has a wider margin than it initially appears. The first incident happened in the 3rd week. There was a crew of Keth mercenaries, 4 of them, who had come in on a private contract and were waiting on the station for their employer to arrive. Keth are physically imposing. They run about 2.5 meters on average, broad across the chest, with a natural exoskeletal layer over the shoulders and forearms that functions roughly like light armor. They're also, to put it diplomatically, not known for their patience or their social awareness. These 4 had been in the Tangle for most of an afternoon. I know because I'd logged their arrival as a standard observation, mercenaries on the station, while a diplomatic exchange was in progress needed to be noted, even if they weren't connected to the exchange. They weren't causing trouble exactly. They were loud. They were taking up more space than was strictly necessary. They had that particular energy that large beings sometimes get when they've had enough to drink, and they've convinced themselves that the space they occupy is by right rather than by negotiation. One of the human dock workers, I'll call him Ren because that's close enough to his actual name, made the mistake of needing to get past them to reach the far end of the bar where he'd been sitting with 2 of his coworkers. He was a compact man, medium height, the kind of person who looked like he'd spent years doing physical work in confined spaces, which he had. He said, "Excuse me." He said it politely. He said it twice. The Keth didn't move. Ren waited. He was patient about it. You could see he was deciding whether this was worth pursuing or whether he should find another route. He made the decision to try once more. He said, "Excuse me," a 3rd time, and the Keth who was blocking the most space turned around slowly and looked at him the way that species looks at something it's decided is not worth acknowledging. Then the Keth made a comment. I'm going to paraphrase it rather than repeat it directly because the direct translation is both offensive and somewhat obscure in its reference points. But the gist of it was, small mammals shouldn't expect large beings to move out of their way, and if the small mammal had a complaint, it could file it with someone who cared. The three other Keth found this very funny. Ren didn't say anything. He stood there for a second with a particular expression on his face that I've since come to recognize very specifically in humans. It's not anger exactly, not yet. It's more like a decision being made, a calculation about whether the situation has reached the threshold, like watching someone quietly determine whether they have run out of options they're willing to accept. Then one of the Keth reached out and flicked Ren on the shoulder, the way you'd flick an insect. Casual, dismissive, not even aggressive, really just contemptuous. And that was the threshold, apparently. Ren hit the Keth. He didn't posture about it. He didn't announce it. He just hit him right across the jaw with the full weight of a working man's shoulder behind it. It was a solid hit. It moved the Keth's head to the side, which is not an easy thing to do because their necks are reinforced. And it made a sound that cut through the noise of the bar and brought most conversations to a stop. What happened next was fast and bad, and I'm going to be honest. I was fairly sure we were about to have a serious medical situation on our hands, because the other three Keth reacted immediately, and they were not small, and they were not unarmed, and one human dock worker with good instincts was not going to survive a sustained encounter with three armed Keth mercenaries in a confined space, however justified his first swing had been. Except, Driven Schraal was already there. I don't know when he entered the bar. I don't know when he'd been watching. He moved the way Velhari move, which is to say he appeared at the critical point at the critical moment, and there was no preceding noise or motion to indicate how he'd gotten there. He was simply present, standing between Ren and the three advancing Keth, and he hadn't drawn a weapon. He was just standing there, looking at them. The three Keth stopped. Not because of a weapon, not because he'd said anything. They stopped because Driven Schraal was looking at them, and the entire bar knew who Driven Schraal was, and the information was processing through the Keth's collective assessment system, and the conclusion it was arriving at was, this is a different kind of problem than the one we thought we had. The first Keth, the one Ren had hit, had recovered and was standing with one hand on a weapon that he hadn't yet drawn. He looked at Driven. He looked at the human. He looked at Driven again. Driven said, very quietly, the human is under my professional observation. Which wasn't true, technically, but nobody was going to test that statement. He said, if any of you would like to create a situation, I'm available. The bar was completely silent. Even the background hum of the ventilation system seemed to quiet, which is physically impossible, but that's how I remember it. The Keth left, all four of them. They paid their tab first, which under the circumstances I thought showed a commendable attention to social form, and then they left. The bar noise gradually returned. Ren looked at Driven for a moment, and Driven looked back at him, and then Driven walked to the other end of the bar and ordered something and sat down, and that appeared to be the end of it. I followed him because that was my job. I said, can I ask what that was? He said, that was a situation I chose not to allow to develop. I said, you didn't know that man before tonight. He said, no. I said, then why? He turned and looked at me with those light-absorbing eyes and said, because the Keth were going to discover something expensive tonight if I hadn't intervened, and it would have been disruptive to the diplomatic schedule. I said, what would they have discovered? He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his drink. He said, how many of them it takes. I didn't understand that either, not yet. The weeks after that were quieter. The diplomatic exchanges proceeded on schedule. I did my job, which was mostly coordination and documentation, and Driven did his, which was to exist on the station in a way that made people uncertain about whether causing problems was worth the risk. But I kept watching him, and the thing I noticed, the thing that built up slowly over those weeks, was that Driven Schraal paid attention to the humans the way he didn't pay attention to most things. He noticed them. He cataloged them, not in a predatory way, not in the way you'd watch a potential threat. More like the way an experienced naturalist watches something they've encountered before in conditions that surprised them, and they've learned to take seriously. There was a woman named Calloway who ran one of the engineering teams in the lower sectors. She was maybe 50 years old, short-cropped gray hair, the kind of face that had weathered things without flinching. I saw Driven watching her once while she was coordinating her team through a difficult repair on one of the station's pressure regulators. The repair was complicated, and one of her team members had been injured mildly, and the timeline was compressing, and you could see her working through it, working through the fatigue and the problem and the responsibility for the team and all of it simultaneously. And she never panicked. She just kept going, methodically focused. Driven watched her the way you'd watch something extraordinary, not with admiration exactly, with recognition. I asked him about it later. I'd become slightly less afraid of him by that point, which is to say I'd graduated from stone in chest to persistent background anxiety, which felt like progress. I said, "You watch the humans a lot." He didn't confirm or deny this. He said, "I've worked with humans before the middle reach contracts." I said, "And?" He said, "Most species, when they're pushed past a certain point, become predictable. They either withdraw or they escalate in ways that follow a recognizable pattern. The psychology of conflict is usually legible if you've seen enough of it." I waited. He said, "Humans are not legible past a certain threshold. They become something else, something that doesn't follow the pattern." I said, "What pattern do they follow instead?" He said, "Their own, which is the problem." He paused and then said something I've thought about many times since. Most species have a limit, a hard ceiling on what they'll do. Humans have limits too, but the ceiling is not where they think it is and not where anyone else expects it to be. And once you've pushed them past a certain point, the calculation changes entirely. I said, "What calculation?" He said, "The one where the cost of stopping becomes irrelevant." I want to describe the station more fully, because the setting matters to what came later. Meridian Cross was not a beautiful station. It was old, maybe 230 years old by the structural dating, and it had been repaired and expanded so many times that its original design was visible only in certain structural elements, the deep bones of the thing, the load-bearing ribs of the older sections. The upper levels were newer and better maintained, climate-controlled and well-lit, where the commercial and diplomatic spaces were. The lower levels were different. The lower levels smelled like recycled air and machine oil, and the particular metallic cold of deep space infrastructure. And the lighting was the functional yellow-white of work lighting rather than the warmer tones they used upstairs. The humans mostly worked the lower levels. It was in the lower levels that I started to understand what Driven had been watching. There was a moment, this was maybe in the 6th week, where one of the station's primary coolant systems began showing stress indicators. Not a full failure, not even close to dangerous yet, but the kind of progressive degradation that needed attention before it became a real problem. The engineering chief filed a maintenance request. The maintenance request got triaged and bumped down the priority list because there were other things happening that week. The diplomatic exchanges had generated some ancillary complications that were taking up administrative attention. The coolant system's indicators got worse. Then they got worse again. Then Calloway, the engineering team leader, decided she was done waiting. I wasn't supposed to be in the lower levels that day. I was there because I'd gotten turned around. I know, embarrassing, 6 weeks in. And I'd come down a wrong corridor and I heard her voice, and I followed it because she was one of the people I'd been monitoring as a baseline. She had assembled her entire team, 7 people. She had the technical schematics on a handheld display and she was talking them through a plan that was, I realized slowly, unauthorized. She was going to do the repair herself without waiting for the official work order to clear. She'd been told to wait. She was not waiting. The Keth overseer responsible for that section of the station appeared about halfway through her briefing. He was not one of the 4 from the bar incident. He was a different one, part of the station's regular staff, and he outranked her on the station hierarchy by 2 or 3 tiers. He told her to stop. He told her the repair would happen when the queue cleared. He told her that unauthorized maintenance activities were a violation of station protocol. She looked at him for 1 measured second. Then she said, "The coolant system is going to fail in 72 hours if it doesn't get serviced. The failure will take out approximately 40% of our pressure management in lower sector C through F. That's life support adjacent. I've filed the report. I've filed it 3 times. We're doing this today." He said she wasn't authorized. She said, "Then write me up later. Right now move." And she turned back to her team and kept talking, and after a long moment the overseer left, and the team did the repair, and they did it in 5 hours, and when the official inspection came through the next day, it confirmed that the degradation had been 4 hours from critical threshold, not 72. Calloway had been conservative in her estimate. Dreven had been watching from the corridor. I don't know how he'd known to be there. Later I asked him, "You saw that?" He said, "I see most things on this station." I said, "That woman just told a Keth overseer to move." He said, "Yes." I said, "And he did." He said, "People with authority tend to yield to people with certainty. It's a dynamic most beings understand instinctively." Then he said, and this is the part I keep coming back to, what she understood and what he understood was that she had already calculated the cost and decided to pay it. And once someone has made that decision, the argument is over. You're only negotiating with yourself at that point. I said, "You think that's specific to humans?" He said, "I think it's rare. I think humans arrive there faster than most species and stay there longer. And I think most beings who have never encountered it before mistake it for recklessness." He paused. "It isn't recklessness. It's a different kind of accounting." 3 more weeks passed. The diplomatic exchanges were approaching their conclusion. The tension on the station had elevated slightly because the completion of a major diplomatic event tends to generate a certain kind of chaos in its aftermath. People who'd been holding their behavior in check for professional reasons feeling the pressure ease, various parties reassessing their situations, that sort of thing. Then the Varath arrived. I need to explain the Varath. They are not mercenaries. They are not exactly military, though they function in military contexts. They are a species with a history of territorial expansion that, over the last 3 centuries, had been managed through increasingly formal containment agreements with the wider galactic community. But those agreements covered their core operations and left a lot of room for activity in the Middle Reach, where enforcement was patchy. The Varath who showed up on Meridian Cross were 8 individuals, a representative contingent, and they'd come because they had interests in one of the trade corridors that the diplomatic exchange was going to affect, and they were not happy about the direction things were going. They were big. They were aggressive in a structural sense. Their biology made them physically dominant in most mixed species environments, and their culture had evolved around that dominance in ways that made them default to establishing hierarchy in any room they entered. They wore their military status openly, and they had come, I understood quickly, to make a point. The point was aimed at the diplomatic parties in the upper levels. But the Varath were staying in the middle-level accommodations, which put them in daily contact with the station's general population, which included the human workers. The first 2 days, nothing happened. The Varath moved through the station like a pressure system, all the social dynamics in the rooms they entered rearranging around them. Most beings gave them space. It was the sensible thing to do. On the third day, a group of 4 Varath decided to walk through the tangle. I was there when it happened. Not because of good planning, I'd been there following up on a logistics issue, but that meant I had a front row position for what came next. The tangle was busy that afternoon. The end of the diplomatic exchange period meant that a lot of people who'd been professionally cautious were relaxing, and the bar and the surrounding spaces were fuller than usual. I estimated maybe 30 beings in a loose collection of groups: Velhari scouts, a table of Mendri traders, some station staff, and a sizable group of human dock workers who'd just come off a long shift and were occupying the central section with the particular relaxed noise of people who'd earned their downtime. The 4 Varath came in and surveyed the space. They did the thing that Varath do, which was essentially to assert by posture and proximity that the space was now subject to their social hierarchy. It was practiced. It was smooth. The Mendri traders immediately became very interested in their drinks. The Velhari scouts made quiet calculations. The Varath moved toward the central area. The human dock workers didn't move. This was not defiance. I want to be clear about that. They didn't move because they were tired, and they'd been sitting there first, and they were in the middle of several conversations. And honestly, I think most of them had not fully processed that a social hierarchy assertion was in progress. Humans are sometimes slower to pick up on that particular signal from species whose dominance displays they haven't encountered before. The Varath perceived it as defiance, or decided to treat it that way, which amounts to the same thing in their cultural calculus. The largest of the 4 Varath, he had unit commander markings on his shoulder plating, walked up to the table where Ren was sitting. Ren again, the same man from the Keth incident. I started to feel a very specific kind of anxiety about what was going to happen. The Varath commander put his hand on the table. He leaned down. He said something in Varath that the translation systems rendered as, "This space belongs to those with the standing to hold it. Your kind doesn't have that standing." Ren looked up at him. He had that expression again. I recognized it this time, the calculating one, the threshold measuring one. He said in a pleasant and completely level tone, "Okay, here's what's going to happen. You're going to back up or we're going to have a problem." The Varath commander laughed. It sounded like metal scraping stone. He said, "You don't have the capacity to create a problem for me." And Ren said just as levelly, "I know, that's not the problem I'm talking about." The other humans at the table had stopped their conversations. They were watching the Varath commander with the particular attentiveness of people who have done the same calculation Ren had done and arrived at the same place. There were 9 of them, 9 humans in that immediate group plus others in the broader space. The Varath had 4. I want to stop here and describe something that I've tried to articulate to various intelligence briefers since this event, and have never quite managed to capture accurately. The shift in the atmosphere of that room was not theatrical. It was not the dramatic escalation you see in entertainment media, where the music swells and the lighting changes. It was something much quieter and more fundamental. It was the moment when the Varath hierarchy assertion hit the human not moving, and something in the calculation of everyone watching quietly updated. Most beings in that room had seen the Varath run this play before. Most beings in that room had watched other species yield to it. The Varath had run it on the Mendri traders 2 days before. I'd heard about that, and the Mendri had politely and sensibly relocated. It was the expected outcome. It was the pattern. The humans were not following the pattern. And the thing was, this is the thing, it wasn't aggression on their side. Not exactly. They weren't standing up, they weren't reaching for weapons, they weren't making counter displays. They were just staying, occupying their space. Looking at the Varath with the focused calm of people who had decided something, and were waiting to see if the other party understood what had been decided. Ren said quietly, "We were here first. We're not moving. If you'd like to sit down, there are seats over there. If you don't want to sit down, you should probably leave." The Varath commander stared at him for a long moment. Then Driven Shral said, from somewhere to the left, "I'd listen to him." I hadn't seen him come in. Nobody had seen him come in. He was standing near the wall, arms loose at his sides, and he was not looking at the Varath commander with any particular hostility. He was looking at him with something that I can only describe as professional communication. The look of a specialist informing another professional of a relevant datum. He said, "I have worked with humans in 6 theaters of active conflict. I have been on the wrong side of humans on 3 of those occasions, which is an experience I can describe to you in detail if you would find that educational." He paused. "They are not following your pattern because they don't recognize your pattern as applicable to them. You can push harder. You're certainly capable of it, but I want to be accurate with you. The cost of what happens next will surprise you. It has surprised everyone who's made that choice." The Varath commander looked at Driven. He looked at the humans. He performed some internal calculation that I was not privy to. Then he straightened. He made a sound that the translation system rendered as something like acknowledged or possibly noted. He turned and walked to a different section of the bar, and his 3 companions followed him, and the tangle noise gradually returned to normal. Ren looked at Driven and gave him a small nod. Driven looked back at him and gave him nothing in return, which I was starting to understand was his version of acknowledgement. I found him later and said, "You do that a lot, step in before it gets bad." He said, "I step in before it gets irreversible. There's a difference." I said, "You keep protecting them." He said, "I'm not protecting them. I'm protecting everyone else from the consequences of underestimating them." That distinction sat with me for a long time. Part 2, the education. Document style, witness narration, first-person account. Filed under Mercenary Intelligence Archive, restricted access, Tier 7 clearance required. Narrator, Vaskareth, former liaison officer, Neutral Compact Trade Authority. The last week before the diplomatic exchange concluded was when things became serious. I'm going to tell this part carefully because some of it is still technically under a soft review, not full classification, but the kind of ambiguous status that means I've had to think about what I'm comfortable putting in a filed account. I'm going to tell it because I think the events have significance that outweighs the administrative caution, and because Driven Shral himself, when I spoke to him afterward, made clear that he thought the record should exist. He said, "What happened should be documented, not because it was exceptional, because it will happen again and people should have been warned." He'd been warning people in his way for a long time. I just hadn't understood the warning. Let me back up. The diplomatic exchange had, over its several weeks, generated a secondary situation that wasn't directly related to the primary negotiations, but had grown alongside them. One of the parties to the exchange had financial interests in several of the station's cargo operations, and those interests had led them to engage a private security contractor, not Driven, a different operation, to manage certain logistical flows. The word manage in this context was doing significant work. What it meant in practice was that certain cargo routes were being redirected in ways that benefited this party's interests, and certain human work crews were being pressured to cooperate with the redirection in ways that were not entirely consistent with their employment agreements. I learned about this gradually. You tend to in liaison work. Information comes in fragments and you assemble it from the pieces that surface. What I learned specifically was that the private security contractor had been leaning on the human dock crews for about 2 weeks. Not violently, economically, shifted work assignments, withheld bonuses, made clear that cooperation would be rewarded and non-cooperation would have professional consequences. The kind of pressure that is technically legal in the middle reach regulatory environment and deeply unpleasant in practice. The human crews had been dealing with it quietly, filing complaints through official channels. The complaints were going nowhere because the party they were complaining about had influence over the administrative offices, and managing their situation with the particular combination of patience and resentment that you build up when you know a fight is coming and you're trying to time it right. The timing point arrived on the 6th day of the final week. One of the senior dock workers, a woman named Petra Vazic, who ran the largest crew on the cargo level, got the paperwork that made clear the situation was moving from pressure to displacement. They were going to restructure the dock work assignments in a way that essentially eliminated her crew's position and replaced it with contractor staff. It wasn't the first such displacement on the station. It was, for her crew, the immediate and personal version of a pattern that had been building for a while. Vazic read the paperwork. She set it down on a crate. She stood quietly for about 30 seconds, which I imagine was some version of the calculation I'd seen on Wren's face. Then she went and talked to Calloway. Calloway went and talked to 3 other crew leads. Those crew leads went and talked to their people. I'm reconstructing this from the security logs afterward. At the time, all I knew was that something was happening in the lower levels that had shifted the energy of the station. And when I checked in with Dreven to see if he was aware, he looked at me and said, "I've been aware since yesterday." I said, "What's happening?" He said, "A decision has been made." I said, "By who?" He said, "By the humans, which means the contractor is now in a situation they don't fully understand yet." I said, "What situation?" He said simply, "An irreversible one." The contractor's name was the Marith Collective. They were a mid-tier private security operation, probably 40 or 50 operatives on and around the station at various points during the engagement period, well-armed, experienced enough, the kind of operation that had handled labor management situations before in the Middle Reach without significant difficulty. They knew what they were doing. They'd done it many times. They had not done it to humans before, or if they had, they'd done it in a context where the humans in question had had no particular community cohesion and no particular history of holding their ground. The dock crews of Meridian Cross had both. What happened over the next 14 hours was not, strictly speaking, violent. I want to be clear about that. Nobody was shot. Nobody was seriously injured. What happened was something more unusual and, in its own way, more effective. The human dock crews stopped working. All of them, every crew, every shift, simultaneously, at a time that they had apparently coordinated without using any channel the contractor was monitoring. The cargo level went silent. The equipment sat still. The loading cycles froze. The transit corridors between the cargo bays and the station's distribution network stopped moving. Meridian Cross, as I mentioned, was a transit hub. It sat at the intersection of 3 major trade corridors. The flow of cargo through its systems was not a background consideration. It was essential. A stoppage of the cargo level didn't just affect the immediate commercial activity on the station. It sent ripples outward along those 3 corridors that began affecting shipping schedules within 6 hours. The contractor sent people to talk to Vazic. She met them in the cargo level's central coordination room, and she was polite and clear. The work stoppage would end when the restructuring paperwork was rescinded and when a formal agreement was put in place regarding the cargo route redirections. Until those conditions were met, the crews were on hold. The contractor's representative said they had the authority to terminate the crew's contracts and bring in their own labor. Vazek said, "Okay." The representative said, "You understand what that means?" Vazek said, "You'll spend about a week sourcing and briefing replacement crews who don't know this system. During that week, the cargo level stays at minimum functionality. By then the shipping delays will have affected parties who have the authority to ask questions about what's happening on this station. Those parties will find out that the diplomatic exchange they thought was proceeding smoothly has generated a secondary labor dispute that's now affecting trade corridor operations. That will be interesting for the party who engaged your services." She paused. "I've been doing this job for 19 years. I know how long it takes to replace a specialized crew. Do you?" The representative left and did not terminate the contracts. 3 hours later, the upper-level administrative offices began receiving messages from 3 different shipping consortiums inquiring about the cargo delays. The diplomatic party with the financial interests started having conversations with their administrative contacts that were, from what I could reconstruct afterward, extremely uncomfortable. Driven and I watched the whole thing from a monitoring station I'd set up in a neutral section of the middle level. He said at some point during hour 8, "You see what they're doing?" I said, "Applying pressure." He said, "Applying calibrated pressure. There's a difference. They identified the point of maximum leverage and they applied force precisely there, not everywhere. There. One location, one movement, maximum effect." He said, "That is not a skill that emerges from desperation. That is a skill that emerges from a history of being in situations where they had to find leverage because brute force wasn't available to them. They've done this before. Maybe not exactly this, but the shape of it, the calculation. Individually, they're formidable, in a coordinated state with a clear objective there." He stopped. I said, "They're what?" He said, "They're very difficult to argue with." Hour 9 was when the contractor made their mistake. I don't know whether it was a decision from their leadership or whether one of their operatives acted independently. The logs suggest the latter, that someone on the contractor's team decided that the soft approach had failed and that a more direct intervention was warranted, and that they made this decision without full authorization from their chain of command. What happened was that 4 contractor operatives went to the cargo level with the stated purpose of restarting the loading equipment manually. They could do this. The equipment wasn't locked. The crews had simply walked away from it. The operatives were armed, which was permitted under station regulations for licensed contractors. They had the technical access to restart the systems. They walked into the cargo bay. The cargo bay was not empty. Approximately 60 human dock workers were in the cargo bay. They hadn't gone anywhere. They were sitting on the crates, on the floors, on the equipment platforms, in the wide open spaces between the loading gantries. Not blocking the equipment directly, just present. 60 people who knew every corner of that space in a way that 40 hours of contractor briefings would never replicate, watching 4 armed operatives walk in and try to figure out how to proceed. Vazek was there. She looked at the operatives and said, "The equipment will respond better if someone who knows how to run it does the startup sequence. I'd offer to help, but I'm on hold at the moment." The lead operative said, "We're authorized to restart operations." Vazek said, "You're authorized to try." The operative looked at the bay. He looked at 60 human workers sitting in patient, focused, absolute stillness. He looked at his 3 colleagues. He made a call. He said he needed guidance from his superior. His superior, apparently, was unavailable because they were in a meeting that was going very badly with the diplomatic party's financial people. He stood in the cargo bay with 60 humans watching him for about 12 minutes, then he and his colleagues left. Driven, watching the security feed next to me, said something I hadn't expected. He said, "Good." Just that, quietly to himself, "Good." I looked at him. He said he made the right decision. People who make the right decision in those moments deserve acknowledgement, even if they'll never know they received it. I said, you were worried he wouldn't. He said, I've seen what happens when they don't. I said, what happens? He was quiet for a long time. Outside the monitoring station window, the station moved around us, its regular rhythms disrupted and adjusting, the sounds of a place recalibrating. Then he said, 15 years ago, I was contracted to provide security for a mining operation in the Yathara system, outer reach, remote. The operation employed about 200 humans in the extraction teams. The corporate oversight decided to change the safety protocols in a way that the extraction teams considered extremely dangerous, and they were correct to consider them dangerous. The subsequent accident reports confirmed that the assessment was accurate. The humans refused to work under the new protocols. They were patient about it. They tried the formal routes first. They tried negotiation. They tried documentation and complaint processes. All of it. He said, the corporate oversight hired a military contractor to enforce compliance. The contractor had about 40 personnel. They went into the mining facility to compel the workers back to their stations. I said, what happened? He said, I'm going to tell you only what I saw with my own eyes, because the reports that came out afterward were incomplete. What I saw was that 40 armed trained mercenaries went into a facility where 200 human workers knew the terrain, knew the systems, knew every vent and access shaft and structural weakness in the building they'd been working in for years, and were angry, genuinely, past the threshold angry, and had nothing left to protect except each other. He paused. The contractor took 23 casualties before they pulled back. The humans took 4, in a mining facility, without military training, against a professional armed force. He said it without drama, without inflection, the way you state a fact you've spent time understanding. That was when I understood that the warning I'd been given early in my career, the warning about humans, was not hyperbole. It was a precise technical assessment that most beings hadn't absorbed because they'd never been in the position to test it. I said, who gave you the warning? He said, another mercenary, older than me. She'd fought alongside humans in the outer reach border conflicts. She said, Velhari, I'll tell you one thing, never make humans angry, not regular angry, not inconvenience angry. Push them past where they've decided they have nothing to lose. That's when you see what they actually are, and by then it's too late to recalculate. He said, I thought she was romanticizing them, projecting. I was wrong. I've been wrong to think it was romanticization every time I've encountered it since. By hour 12, the situation had resolved. Not because of anything dramatic, because the accumulated pressure had reached the people with enough authority to override the contractor's interests. The shipping consortium inquiries had escalated. The diplomatic party's financial operation had received calls from their principals who were deeply unhappy about the attention the situation was generating. The administrative offices had been contacted by the station's nominal oversight authority, which was normally content to let the middle reach operate without intervention, but had certain trade corridor agreements it was obligated to uphold. Vazik met with a representative from the administrative office at the cargo-level coordination room. The restructuring was suspended pending a full review. A formal agreement was put in place regarding cargo route management, with oversight provisions. The contractor's presence on the cargo level was restricted. Vazik signed the agreement. She shook the administrator's hand. She went back to her crew and said something I didn't hear from where I was positioned, and the crew started getting up and moving toward the equipment. And within about 40 minutes the cargo level was operational again, and the loading cycles resumed, and the sounds of the station's working life came back in a wave. I was standing in the upper observation corridor, watching through the glass, when Driven came to stand beside me. I said it worked. He said, of course it worked. I said, you knew it would. He said, I knew they'd calculated correctly. When humans calculate correctly, they tend to execute. The execution is usually effective. I said, you sound like you admire them. He was quiet for a moment. Below us, the cargo level was fully alive again. 60 people doing the work they'd been doing for years, moving with the practiced ease of bodies that knew the space completely. He said, I was taught to assess, not to admire, but I'll tell you something honestly because you've been beside me for 4 months and you've earned the honesty. In 90 years, I have seen many things. I have worked with many species. Every species has qualities that you learn to factor in when you're planning. Every species has a version of what they can do and what they won't do, and the math usually works out predictably. He said, humans are the only species I've encountered where I consistently revise my estimate upward after I've seen them in a real situation. Every other species I assess and then refine toward accuracy. With humans I assess and then find out I was underestimating them. Every time. In 90 years, I have not once overestimated what humans were capable of when they decided something mattered enough. I said, that sounds like admiration. He said, it sounds like accurate accounting. Then he said, I'll also tell you something else. The qualities that make them what they are in conflict, the ones that make them dangerous when they're pushed too far, those same qualities are what makes them extraordinary in other contexts. That engineer, your Callaway woman, what she did with the coolant system, working through exhaustion and a compressed timeline and an obstruction and a responsibility for others, that is the same quality. It's the same thing expressed in different conditions. He said, they carry something in them that I don't have a precise word for in Velhari. In the common translation language, the closest word is probably determination. But that's not quite right because determination implies a choice. This is more fundamental than a choice. It's structural. It's built into how they function. He paused. Whatever it is, I've learned to account for it. I've learned not to be on the wrong side of it. The last day of the diplomatic exchange came and went without significant incident. The parties signed what they'd come to sign. The delegations began their departures. The station returned to its normal rhythms. Dreven's contract with the compact concluded at the end of that day. He filed his reports thorough. I would learn, reading them later, more thorough than strictly required, and he began his own departure preparations. I went to find him because I'd been thinking about something for the entire final week, and I hadn't found the right moment to raise it. I found him in the small quarters he'd occupied for 4 months, which were extraordinarily neat, a fact that somehow both surprised me and didn't surprise me at all. He had very few personal items, a weapon, secured, a data unit, a few things I didn't recognize that were probably Velhari in origin. I said, can I ask you something? He said, you've been asking things for 4 months. I said, why do you step in, every time? When the Keth, when the Vareth, when the contractor, why do you keep intervening? You could have let things run. He looked at me for a moment. He said, the Keth incident would have ended with a dead human and a Keth facing a manslaughter claim. The Vareth incident would have ended with a full-scale altercation between 8 Vareth and however many humans decided to participate, which given the crew composition at the time would have been upward of 20. The contractor incident. I assessed there was approximately a 40% chance that the armed operative team would attempt to physically compel the workers once their superior failed to respond to the communication, which would have triggered an engagement in an enclosed space with people who knew that space very well. And I think you've heard me describe how those situations tend to resolve. He said, I intervene because the cost of not intervening is high, and I have the capacity to change the calculation at low cost to myself, and that is the most efficient use of the resources available. I said, that's the professional answer. He said, yes. I said, "Is there another one?" He was quiet for a long moment. He looked out the small viewport in his quarters, the particular darkness of deep space, the distant lights of navigation beacons marking the corridors that converged on Meridian Cross. He said, "The humans on this station are doing work that this station requires to function. They're doing it competently. They're doing it with," I said, "I don't have the word in Velhari, in the common language. Dignity is closer than determination. They're doing difficult work in difficult conditions with dignity, and with what I can only call a refusal to be diminished by the conditions they're in." He said, "In my experience, beings who operate that way deserve to not be blindsided by things I had the information to prevent. It's not sentiment. It's a form of professional respect." He paused. "Also," he said, and something in his voice shifted almost imperceptibly, "I have seen what happens to species who make the mistake of pushing human beings past the point of no return. I have seen the aftermath. It is expensive, for everyone, for the humans too, and I find I have a preference against expensive outcomes when they're preventable." I said, "So you protect them?" He said, "I protect everyone from each other, but yes, the humans somewhat specifically, because they are." He seemed to search for words, which was unusual for him. He said, "They're new to all of this, to the wider galaxy. They've been in space for 200 years, which is nothing. My species has been in space for 3,000 years, the Keth for 4,000, the Varath for over 5. And in 200 years, the humans have come from their one world to the Middle Reach, and they've brought themselves with them. Everything that they are, the stubbornness and the calculation and the thing I don't have a word for, and they haven't learned yet how seriously everyone else is going to have to take them eventually." He said, "I already know. I learned it the expensive way in the Yathara system, watching a contractor make a catastrophic miscalculation. I've been trying, in my limited and professional way, to prevent other beings from making the same miscalculation." He said, "My warning, the one I gave you on the first day, it was not a caution about humans. It was a caution about everyone else." He left Meridian Cross the following morning. I watched his ship move through the docking corridor from the observation deck, a compact vessel that moved with the kind of quiet precision that made it easy to understand why the man who flew it had the reputation he had. I stayed on the station for another 3 weeks, wrapping up administrative matters. In that time I talked to Rin, I talked to Vazik, I talked to Calloway. I told them, in general terms, that the mercenary who'd stepped in on the Keth incident had expressed a specific kind of professional regard for the human crews of Meridian Cross. I didn't use Dreven's exact words, partly because I wasn't sure I could reproduce them accurately, and partly because I thought the specific framing might not land in the way he'd intended it. What I said was, "He said you're going to be taken seriously eventually, by everyone. He said he figures he knows it a bit ahead of schedule." Vazik looked at me for a moment. She said, "That's an odd thing for a mercenary to say." I said, "He's an odd mercenary." She said, "He's right, though." She said it without bravado, without heat, just the steady, factual tone of someone stating something they've known for a long time and have simply been waiting for the wider community to catch up to. That, I thought, that was the quality Dreven had been trying to name, the one he didn't have a word for in Velhari. It wasn't determination, it wasn't stubbornness, it wasn't even dignity exactly, though that came close. It was something more like a relationship with time. A sense, sometimes conscious, sometimes not, that the situation as it exists right now is not the situation as it will exist later, and that the distance between those 2 points is something you can work with if you're patient enough and focused enough and willing to carry the cost of the interval. Humans had learned that on Earth, in the particular and often brutal school of being a species that had survived everything that could be thrown at a species on a single difficult world, and then had survived the shock of learning they were not alone in the universe, and then had survived 2 centuries of being the newcomers at a galactic table where everyone else had centuries of history they didn't have. They'd learned to carry the interval, to be patient and focused and willing. And then, when the interval was over and the situation was right, to move in a way that was, as Driven had put it, very difficult to argue with. I'm filing this account because I think it belongs in a record somewhere, not as a classified intelligence document, though I know it'll be classified once it's submitted, because that's how the compact works, as something closer to a testimony. There's a mercenary out there, the most feared operative in the Middle Reach by most estimates, with 90 years of professional history and 17 different names, and a file that takes an hour to read if you read fast. And his single most consistent piece of professional advice, the thing he told me on the first day and demonstrated across 4 months, and has apparently been demonstrating for a significant portion of his career, is this: never make humans angry. Not because they'll always win, not because they're the most powerful species in the galaxy. They're not yet, probably not by any simple measure of military capacity or technological development, but because the cost accounting changes when you push them past a certain point, because the ceiling on what they'll do is not where you think it is, because they've been carrying the interval for a long time and they're very good at it, and when they stop carrying it, what comes out the other side is something that has consistently surprised every species that's encountered it, including one that had 3,000 years of experience to draw from. He warned the Keth, he warned the Varath, he tried in his careful way to warn the contractor. He was right every time. I think the warning is going to become more relevant, not less, as the decades pass and the humans move further from their one world into the wider galaxy. I think there will be more species that need to hear it, and more situations where the people who didn't hear it soon enough discover the lesson the expensive way. If this document survives long enough to reach them, whoever they are, whatever species, whatever situation, I want them to have the record. I want them to have the 90 years of professional observation that Driven Schraal distilled into a single phrase and then spent his career demonstrating was not hyperbole. Never make humans angry. Not because of what they'll do to you in the moment. Because of what they'll become in the interval between when you push them and when they're done. Somewhere out in the Middle Reach, I imagine Driven Schraal is watching another situation develop, reading the room, calculating the angles, looking at the humans in the space with that particular attentive quality, that sense of professional recognition. And I imagine he's deciding, again, whether to step in before it gets irreversible. He usually does. That's the other thing about him. For all his careful talk of professional efficiency and cost accounting and accurate assessment, in 4 months, I never once saw him get the calculation wrong about when to intervene. Not once. And his interventions were always just barely enough, never more than necessary. Someone who keeps getting that calculation right, in my experience, is not just running numbers. They're working from something deeper than numbers. Which, I suppose, is one more thing he has in common with the people he keeps defending.